Amir Nahumi was one of two pilots on alert at the southern tip of the Sinai when the war began. It was the afternoon of October 6, 1973. Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. He was young and, by his own account, barely blooded. Then the radar filled with contacts. Something close to 30 Egyptian aircraft were coming in against his base at Sharm el-Sheikh, and there were exactly 2 Israeli Phantoms to meet them. Nahumi and his 3 fellow airmen took off into a sky that had no business being survivable, jettisoned their fuel tanks, and turned straight into the incoming wave. In the space of a few minutes, he shot down several enemy aircraft. A cannon burst stalled one of his engines in the middle of the fight, and he restarted it in the air and kept going. It was one of the most lopsided victories in the history of air combat, and for a few hours it looked like proof of everything Israel believed about itself. For 6 years, the Israeli Air Force had owned the skies over the Middle East, and mornings like this were why. But Sharm el-Sheikh was far to the south, away from the real killing ground. Up along the Suez Canal and over the Golan Heights, the same Air Force was about to meet something it could not dogfight, could not outfly, and at first, could not even detect. And that belief in its own invincibility was about to die in the smoke. The weapon that finally broke the missiles was not a secret jet or a magic jamming pod. That is the myth. The truth is stranger, and it took 32 days, a fleet of American cargo planes the size of buildings, and a column of Israeli tanks crawling through a gap in the enemy line in the dark. But to understand how Israel climbed out of that hole, we have to go back to a decision made 3 years earlier, on the west bank of a canal, when nobody was shooting at all. Before we go on, a small favor. Cold War Impact is a small channel covering Cold War and military history, and our reach has dropped off lately. If you like carefully researched history like this, please subscribe, leave a comment, and share the video. Every single interaction helps the channel reach new people and lets me keep making these deep dives. Now, back to the desert. In the summer of 1970, Egypt and Israel were bleeding each other white in a slow grinding fight along the Suez Canal that history calls the War of Attrition. Israeli jets ruled it. They flew where they liked and struck what they wanted, and the Egyptian side could do little but absorb the punishment. Then the Soviet Union arrived in force. Moscow poured advisors, crews, and missiles into Egypt, and in places, Soviet personnel manned the launchers themselves. When a ceasefire took hold in August of that year, both sides were supposed to freeze their forces in place. Instead, under cover of the truce, the Egyptians and their Soviet partners hauled their missile batteries right up to the edge of the canal. It was exactly the outcome Israel had spent lives to prevent, and it became the foundation of everything that followed. Over the next 3 years, the Egyptians built something the world had never quite seen before: a wall in the sky. Along the canal, they packed in overlapping rings of surface-to-air missiles, layered so that an aircraft dodging one battery would fly straight into the reach of the next. High cover came from the older systems, the S-75, that NATO called the SA-2, a big command-guided missile that had been shooting down aircraft since the skies over Vietnam and had claimed an American U-2 spy plane over the Soviet Union back in 1960. Below it sat the SA-3, tuned for medium and low altitude. On paper, these were known quantities. The Israelis had studied them for years and believed they could handle them. What they could not handle was the new one, the SA-6. In its Soviet service, it was the Kub, and to the pilots who would soon face it, it became the single most frightening object in the sky. It was mobile. It rode on a tracked chassis that could shift position in minutes and set up again almost anywhere, which meant the map of the threat was never the same 2 hours running. Each battery traveled with a radar the West nicknamed Straight Flush, and launchers carrying 3 missiles apiece, 3 fingers reaching up from the sand. But the truly dangerous part was invisible. The SA-6 guided on a continuous wave radar signal that Israeli warning gear was not built to detect. A pilot could be locked, tracked, and fired upon, and hear nothing at all. The jamming pods that were supposed to spoof a missile's aim did not work against it, because they had been designed to fool a different kind of radar entirely. The Israelis had a countermeasure for the wrong weapon. Down at the bottom of this stack sat the killers that finished what the missiles started. When a pilot dove low to escape a missile lock, he flew straight into the ZSU-23-4, a tracked vehicle with 4 radar-directed cannon that threw a wall of shells across the low sky. And spread everywhere, In the hands of ordinary infantry were thousands of shoulder-fired SA-7 missiles that chased the heat of a jet engine. Any one of these on its own was survivable. Stacked together, tuned to cover each other's blind spots, they formed a box of overlapping death that Egyptian ground troops could hide beneath. That was the whole idea. The Egyptian plan did not ask their air force to beat the Israelis in the sky. It asked their soldiers to cross the canal and stay underneath the missile umbrella, where Israeli jets could not touch them. It was a plan built entirely around denying Israel the one thing it counted on most: control of the air. By the first week of October, the numbers on the Egyptian side of the canal were staggering. Something like 150 missile batteries were woven into the defense, a mix of the older systems and the deadly new mobile ones, backed by many hundreds of radar-guided guns and thousands of the shoulder-fired missiles. On the Golan Heights, the Syrians had built their own version of the same wall, dozens of batteries stacked across the high ground. Two separate missile fortresses, north and south, waiting, and Israel walked into both of them almost blind. The attack came on Saturday, October 6, 1973, Yom Kippur, when much of the country stops entirely. In the early afternoon, the Egyptians and Syrians struck together, one from the west across the canal, one from the north across the Golan. Israel had seen warning signs and argued about them for days. Prime Minister Golda Meir had made one fateful choice. She refused to strike first. If Israel fired the opening shot, she reasoned, it would face the war without a friend in the world and without American support. So the Air Force that had won the last war with a lightning preemptive strike was ordered to wait and take the blow. That decision shaped the first hours. Israeli Phantoms had actually been loaded with bombs for a strike on the Egyptian missile sites. When the order came down not to preempt, they had to dump their loads and scramble to defend the country instead. And when the Air Force finally did throw itself at the fronts, it flew straight into the two missile walls it had underestimated. In the opening 12 hours, the Israelis lost around 30 of their A-4 Skyhawk attack jets, several Phantoms, and a handful of older fighters. The best air force in the Middle East was falling out of the sky, and most of the men pulling the triggers were not enemy pilots. They were teenagers and reservists on the ground, feeding missiles into launchers. The Israeli Air Force did have a plan for exactly this. It was called Tagar, and they had rehearsed it for 3 years. It was a methodical, step-by-step campaign to tear down the Egyptian missile wall in a single day, wave after wave, hitting the airfields first, and then working through the batteries in sequence. On the morning of October 7th, the second day, they began. The first wave went in against Egyptian air bases and came back having done real damage for the loss of 2 Skyhawks and their pilots. The system was working. The plan that had been drilled for years was actually unfolding. Then the phone rang. Up on the Golan, the Syrian army had smashed through the thin Israeli line and was pouring toward the heart of the country, and the defense minister, Moshe Dayan, was gripped by something close to panic. He ordered the Air Force commander, Major General Benny Peled, to stop everything in the south and send the entire Air Force north to save the Golan. Peled argued. He knew that breaking off Tagar in the middle meant it could never be put back together. Dayan cut him off. This was not a suggestion, he said. It was an order, and so the one carefully built plan to destroy the Egyptian missiles was abandoned halfway through, never to resume. Historians still argue that this was one of the great lost chances of the war. The wall in the south would stand for 2 more weeks. What happened next on the Golan turned the lesson into a massacre. Wrenched north without preparation, the Air Force threw together a hasty strike against the Syrian missile batteries and called it Dugman 5. But the intelligence was wrong and out of date. The drones and the reconnaissance had been pointed south at Egypt, and in the hours since, the Syrian mobile batteries had simply moved. The Phantoms rolled in, expecting to find missile sites where the maps said they would be, and found empty ground and waiting launchers instead. In a matter of minutes, 6 Phantoms were shot out of the sky. 2 crewmen were killed and 9 were captured. For all that loss, they destroyed a single Syrian battery. Dugman 5 broke something in the Israeli Air Force that morning. The dream of rolling back the missiles in one clean stroke was dead on both fronts. Now the Air Force was trapped in the worst possible role. The ground armies on both fronts were buckling and screaming for help from above, so the jets were forced to fly close support directly over the missile belts, again and again, taking losses on every pass. In the first 3 days, the Israelis flew around 1,200 sorties and lost roughly 50 aircraft doing it. That is a loss rate no air force on Earth can sustain for long. And when the final accounting of the war was done, the pattern was brutally clear. Israel lost more than 100 aircraft, and roughly 9 out of every 10 of them fell not to enemy fighters, but to missiles and guns fired from the ground. The dogfight, the thing Israeli pilots were the best in the world at, was barely a factor. They were being killed by the sky itself. There were still moments of brilliance in the wreckage. On October 9th, a small formation of phantoms from a squadron nicknamed the Bat flew a daring low-level raid all the way to Damascus and struck the Syrian General Staff headquarters through heavy cloud, led by a deputy squadron commander who would be decorated for it. It was proof that the men and the machines were still superb. But single raids do not win a war against a wall of missiles. In the second week of the fighting, one of the Air Force's finest, Lieutenant Colonel Avraham Lanier, the commander of a Mirage squadron, was hit by a missile over Syrian territory. He managed to point his crippled aircraft back toward Israel before he had to bail out, but he came down in Syrian hands and was captured. He never came home. He died in captivity, and the full truth of his fate would not emerge for years. Story after story ran the same way. The skill was there, the courage was there, the sky was closed. Here is where the myth and the truth split apart. The story that gets told is that America shipped over some miracle of electronics that switched the missiles off. That is not what happened. The thing that actually cracked the missile wall was far less glamorous and far more human. It was a column of tanks in the dark, and it was a decision made by the man leading them. By the middle of October, the ground war had turned. On October 14th, the Egyptians made a fatal mistake. Confident after their early success, they pushed a massive armored force out from under their own missile umbrella and into the open Sinai, and there, in the clear, Israeli tanks and jets tore them apart in one of the largest tank battles since the Second World War. The Egyptian attack collapsed, and it left a seam in their line, a gap between their two field armies, and Israel had a general who lived for exactly this kind of opening, Ariel Sharon. On the night of October 15th, Sharon's division drove for that gap in a brutal, confused, close-range fight around a place the Israelis called the Chinese Farm. Paratroopers under a colonel named Danny Matt crossed the Suez Canal in small rubber boats in the darkness, roughly 750 men slipping onto the far bank where no Israeli was supposed to be. Behind them came tanks, ferried across on rafts, and once those tanks were loose on the western side, everything changed. Because on the far bank sat the missile batteries. The whole towering wall of Egyptian air defense had been built to shoot up at aircraft. It had almost nothing to stop a tank rolling up on it from the ground. The order that went out to the crossing force put it plainly. Priority to the missiles. A tank commander named Haim Erez pushed his small force more than 12 kilometers deep into the Egyptian rear and simply drove from one missile site to the next, destroying them one after another. In a single major raid, the Israelis wrecked 3 Egyptian missile bases and did not lose a man doing it. Battery by battery, the wall came apart from below, and as each site was crushed or forced to pack up and flee, a patch of sky reopened. The moment the missiles were gone from a stretch of front, the Israeli jets flooded back into it and became the deadly, dominant force they had always been. In one of the strangest reversals in the history of air warfare, it was the ground army that rescued the Air Force. The tanks tore holes in the ceiling, and the pilots poured through them. Now, and only now, does the American story fit into its proper place. Because while the tanks were breaking the wall, Israel was running out of everything. In the first week of fighting, the country had burned through mountains of ammunition, missiles and aircraft, at a rate no one had planned for. Tanks were being lost faster than they could be repaired. Artillery shells were running low. The Air Force had gaps in its ranks that its small industry could never fill in time. Israel could win the battle at the front and still lose the war to its own empty warehouses. And so, on October 9th and 10th, it began pleading with Washington for resupply. What followed was tangled in politics for days. Israel first tried to fly its own airliners back and forth, then tried to hire American commercial cargo planes, but the civilian carriers refused, terrified of Arab retaliation and the threat to their oil business. The machinery in Washington ground slowly, while Israeli commanders watched their stockpiles shrink. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union had already begun its own massive airlift, pouring weapons and ammunition into Egypt and Syria to keep the offensive alive. This was the Cold War laid bare. Two superpowers, feeding two sides of the same war through the air, each afraid of what would happen if their client lost. On October 12th, President Richard Nixon cut through the delay. Frustrated by the excuses and the half measures, he ordered the United States military to run the entire resupply itself, and by one account, told Henry Kissinger to send everything that could fly. The operation was named Nickel Grass. Within hours, the giant transports of the American Military Airlift Command were in the air, and here they ran into a wall of their own. Nearly every American ally in Europe, frightened of an Arab oil embargo, refused to let the planes land or even cross their airspace. Country after country slammed the door. Only Portugal relented, allowing the Americans to use a single airfield in the Azores, a cluster of islands far out in the Atlantic. That lonely runway became the hinge of the entire operation, because the cargo planes of that era could not yet refuel in mid-air, and without it, they simply could not reach Israel. The route stretched for thousands of kilometers, threading a narrow corridor down the middle of the Mediterranean, with the American Sixth Fleet watching over it, until Israeli fighters could pick the transports up near the coast and bring them in. The first great C-5 Galaxy touched down at the airport near Tel Aviv late on October 14th, carrying 97 tons of artillery shells at the precise moment the guns were running dry. Over the next 24 hours, hundreds more tons followed, then thousands. For 32 days it never stopped. Two types of aircraft carried the load, the C-141 Starlifter and the enormous C-5 Galaxy, which could swallow whole tanks and helicopters inside its belly. They flew day and night through fatigue and weather and the constant strain on crews and machines. By the time the last plane landed in mid-November, the Americans had flown more than 560 missions and delivered over 22,000 tons of tanks, artillery, ammunition, missiles, electronic gear, and replacement aircraft. The Soviet airlift into Egypt and Syria was vast as well, hundreds of flights hauling many thousands of tons, but the American effort outweighed it. And crucially, the flow of American electronic countermeasures and anti-radiation missiles, the weapons meant to blind and kill enemy radar, helped the Israelis chip away at the missiles they had not yet overrun and let them replace the terrible losses of the first week almost as fast as they occurred. It is important to be honest about what the airlift did and did not do. It did not flip a switch and turn off the missile wall. The wall was broken on the ground, by tanks, and by the Egyptians' own fatal move into the open. What Nickel Grass did was just as decisive in the long run. It meant that when Israel spent a tank, it got another. When it emptied a magazine, it was refilled. It told a small country fighting two larger armies that it would not be allowed to run out of the means to survive. It steadied the war, and it steadied the men fighting it, and it made certain that the reversal at the front could not be undone by an empty depot. The final days of October carried the war to the edge of something far worse than a regional conflict. As Israeli forces surrounded the trapped Egyptian Third Army on the wrong side of the canal, the Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev sent Nixon a message that landed like a hammer. If the United States would not act jointly to stop the fighting, he warned, the Soviet Union would consider acting alone. It read as a threat to send Soviet troops into the Middle East directly. In Washington, with Nixon consumed and weakened by the Watergate scandal, his senior officials gathered late in the night of October 24th and made a grave decision. They raised American military forces around the world to a heightened state of nuclear alert, the highest peacetime readiness the country used. For a few tense days, the two superpowers stood closer to open confrontation than they had since the Cuban Missile Crisis 11 years earlier. Then the pressure eased. A firmer ceasefire took hold. The alert was quietly stood down, and later evidence suggested the Soviet threat had been more bluff than plan. But for those days, the fight over a canal and a line of missiles had pulled the whole world to the brink. When the guns finally stopped near the end of October, the reckoning began. Israel had held, then won, but the cost was carved into the nation's memory. More than 2,000 of its soldiers were dead. The Air Force had lost over 100 aircraft, the overwhelming majority to the missiles and guns it had gone to war believing it could ignore. The myth of the untouchable Israeli jet was gone forever. And the men who ran that Air Force knew exactly why. They had been humbled not by better pilots, but by a wall of technology on the ground that they had failed to take seriously until it was killing them by the dozen. Some of the people at the center of the story carried it quietly afterward. Benny Peled, the Air Force commander who had been forced to abandon his missile plan on the second day, later admitted that in the darkest hours he had exaggerated how close his force was to collapse, bending the truth to push the leadership toward the canal crossing that finally turned the war. It was a confession that showed just how thin the margin had felt from the inside. Avraham Lanier, the squadron commander lost over Syria, was posthumously honored for his courage, his death in captivity, a wound that stayed open for years. And across the ocean, the American crews who had flown 32 days of unbroken missions folded back into their bases with little fanfare, their part in keeping a nation supplied largely unknown to the public they served. The deepest mark the war left was not on any single person. It was on the way air forces would think forever after. Israel took the humiliation of 1973 and turned it into an obsession. For 9 years, the Air Force built an answer to the missile wall, piece by piece. Drones to bait the radars into switching on. Aircraft packed with equipment to listen, locate and jam. Missiles that would ride an enemy radar beam straight back down to its source. Airborne command posts to tie it all together in real time. They were determined never again to send men into a wall of missiles half-blind. The proof came in June of 1982, over the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, where the Syrians had rebuilt the same kind of missile fortress that had bled Israel white 9 years earlier. In an operation the Israelis called Mauled Cricket 19, the Air Force did in about 2 hours what had been impossible in 1973. It destroyed the great majority of the Syrian missile batteries and shot down scores of Syrian aircraft that rose to defend them, and it did so without losing a single jet to those missiles. It was the first time a Western Air Force had systematically dismantled a dense Soviet-built missile network, and the whole world's militaries took notes. The trauma of the Yom Kippur War had been transformed into a new way of fighting, one that treated enemy air defenses as the first target, not an afterthought. That lesson never went away, and you can see it playing out right now. In the skies over Ukraine, neither side has been able to seize control of the air, because both are ringed by dense, mobile, modern versions of the same missile systems, the direct descendants of the weapons that stunned Israel in 1973. Aircraft are pushed to the edges, and the fighting is handed to drones and long-range missiles instead. A war of mutual air denial that a Skyhawk pilot from the Sinai would recognize instantly. And when Israel struck deep into Iran in late 2024, it did so by first tearing down Iranian air defenses in the modern style. The same doctrine born from the disaster over the canal, refined across half a century. The tools have changed almost beyond recognition. The problem has not. What happens when one side raises a wall of missiles the other side cannot fly through? That was the question the Yom Kippur War asked, in smoke and fire, over 9 days in October. Israel came within a hair of never finding the answer. The missile wall was not beaten by a wonder weapon or a clever gadget flown in at the last minute. It was beaten by soldiers in tanks who drove into a gap in the dark and pulled the wall down from below, and it was kept from being beaten by an ocean of American cargo that made sure a small country could not be starved into defeat. 2 things had to be true at once. Israel had to break the wall, and Israel had to be resupplied faster than it could bleed. Take away either one, and the map of the Middle East today would look nothing like it does. The wall stood for the length of time it took a nation to remember that command of the sky is never a birthright. It is something you have to win again in every war, against whatever new weapon the other side has hidden in an open field. Israel learned that lesson in the worst way there is, one falling aircraft at a time. And the 32 days of engines droning over the Mediterranean, and the nights of tank tracks grinding toward the canal, are the reason it lived long enough to never forget it.